Alright, here we are, Chapter 2. Monsieur de Treville's Anteroom. Monsieur de Treville, as his family in Gascony was still called, or Monsieur de Treville, as he had finally come to be known in Paris, really had begun like D'Artagnan. That is, lacking money, but generously endowed with the daring, quick-wittedness, and shrewd intelligence that often make the poorest Gascon country squire receive more from his paternal inheritance in expectation than the richest nobleman in Perigord-Berry receives in reality. In a time when violence was an everyday matter, his insolent courage and still more insolent good luck had enabled him to reach the top of the difficult ladder known as favor at the court, climbing it 4 rungs at a time. He was a friend of the king, who, as is well known, revered the memory of his father, Henry IV. Monsieur de Treville's father had served Henry IV faithfully in the wars against the Catholic League. Unable to reward him with money, which he lacked all his life, so that he always paid his debts with the only thing he never had to borrow, wit, the king authorized him, after the surrender of Paris, to take his coat of arms, a golden lion passant on gules, with the motto Fidelis et Fortis. This enriched him in honor, but left him scantily supplied with worldly goods, which the result that which he died, his only bequest to his son, was his sword and his motto. Because of the double gift and the unblemished name that went with it, Monsieur de Treville was admitted into the young prince's household, where he served so well with his sword and was so faithful with to his motto that Louis XIII, one of the best swordsmen in the kingdom, sometimes said that if he had a friend who was going to fight a duel, he would recommend himself as his second, and then Treville, or perhaps Treville even before himself. Louis XIII had genuine affection for Treville, a royal, selfish affection, but still affection. In those troubled times, everyone in high position tried to surround himself with men of Treville's quality. Many other noblemen could claim the epithet of strong, which was the second part of his motto, but few could claim faithful, its first part. Treville was one of those few. He was also one of those rare people with obedient intelligence of a mastiff, reckless valor, alert eyes, and hands always ready to act. He used his eyes to see if the king was displeased with someone, and his hands to strike down that displeasing someone, who might have proved to be an assassin like Besme, Marvers, Parlot de Mer, or Vitry. For a time, all that prevented him from rising to great heights was lack of the right opportunity. He was constantly on the lookout for that opportunity and determined to seize it if it came within reach. Then Louis XIII placed him in command of the king's musketeers, who, in fanatical devotion to their sovereign, equaled Henry III's ordinaries and Louis XI's Scottish guards. The cardinal did not let himself be outdone by the king. When he saw the formidable elite corps with which Louis XIII had surrounded himself, this secondary, or rather this primary king of France, decided that he too must have his guards. He therefore had his musketeers as Louis XIII had his. The two rival powers searched all of the French provinces and even foreign countries for renowned swordsmen to place in their service. During their evening chess game, Cardinal Richelieu and Louis XIII often argued about the merits of their respective bodyguards. Each praised the bearing and courage of his own, and while they both openly opposed duels and brawls, each secretly urged his men to fight against the others and felt deep sorrow or boundless joy at each defeat or victory. So we are told, at least, in the memoirs of a man who took part in a few of those defeats and many of those victories. Treville had appealed to his master's weak side, and it was to this shrewd approach that he owed the long and constant favor of a monarch who has not left a reputation for being loyal in his friendships. He made his musketeers parade in front of it Cardinal Richelieu with a mocking expression that made His Eminency's gray mustache bristle with rage. Treville had an admirable understanding of war in that time, when if soldiers were not living at the expense of the enemy, they lived at the expense of their compatriots. His own soldiers formed a legion of turbulent daredevils who recognized no authority but his. Unruly, hard-drinking, and scarred, the king's musketeers, or rather Treville's musketeers, invaded taverns, promenades, and public games, talking loudly, curling their mustaches, rattling their swords, and joyously clashing with the cardinal's guards when they encountered them. They would then make joking remarks as they drew their swords in the street. They were sometimes killed, but in that case they were sure to be mourned and avenged. They often killed, and then they were sure not to have to languish in prison, because Monsieur de Treville would have them released. They worshipped him, and constantly sang his praises, and pugnacious ruffians though they were, they trembled before him like schoolboys before their master, obeyed him unquestionably, and were always ready to die in order to wipe away the slightest reproach from him. Treville had used that powerful weapon first for the king and the king's friends, then for himself and his own friends. But in none of the many memoirs that have come down from us from that time is there any mention of his ever having been accused, even by his enemies, who were numerous among many men of letters as among men of the sword, of taking money for the services of his men. With a rare genius for intrigue that made him equal to the greatest schemers, he still remained an honest man, and despite the roughness and fatigue of his military exercises, he was one of the most accomplished men in his day in the arts of gallantry, elegant flirtation, and seduction. He was famous for his success with women. He was as famous for his success with women as Bassompierre had been 20 years earlier, which is saying a great deal. He had thus reached the peak of human condition. He was admired, feared, and loved. Louis XIV's vast radiance dimmed all the lesser luminaries at his court, but his father, a sun unable to shine on many different worlds, did not prevent his favorites from having their own splendor, or his courtiers from proving their personal worth. Besides the levees, the king and the cardinal, there were then in Paris more than 200 minor levees held in varying degrees of esteem. Treville's was one of those most eagerly sought after. Beginning at 6 o'clock in the morning in summer and 8 o'clock in winter, the courtyard of his house on the Rue de Colombière was like a camp. 50 or 60 musketeers who seemed to work in relays so that there would always be an impressive number of them walked about fully armed and ready for anything. The staircase was large enough for our civilization to build an entire house in the space it occupied. Up and down it went Parisians seeking some favor or another, provincial noblemen eager to be enrolled, and servants in liveries of all colors bringing messages for Monsieur de Treville from their masters. On the long circular benches in the anteroom sat the elite, that is, those who had been summoned. Here there was a hum of conversation from morning till evening, while in his study next to the anteroom, Monsieur de Treville received visitors, listened to complaints, and gave orders, and like the king on his balcony at the Louvre, he had only to go down to his window to inspect his armed forces. On the day when D'Artagnan presented himself, the assembly was impressive, especially to a provincial newly arrived in Paris, though it was true that this provincial was a Gascon, and that, especially in those days, Gascon had the reputation of not being easily intimidated. As soon as the visitor passed the massive gate studded with long, square-headed nails, he found himself amidst a loud, playful, and sometimes quarrelsome swordsmen walking back and forth in the courtyard. Only an officer, a great lord, or a pretty woman could have made an easy passage through those turbulent waters. D'Artagnan's heart was pounding when he stepped into the disorderly throng. His long rapier hung beside his slender leg, and he kept one hand on the brim of his hat with the half-smile of an embarrassed provincial who wants to put up a good front. He breathed more freely each time he passed a group, but then he would realize that they were turning to look at him, and for the first time in his life, after having had a rather good opinion of himself till then, he felt ridiculous. When he reached the staircase, it was even worse. At the foot of the stairs, 4 musketeers were playing a game, while 10 or 12 of their comrades waited their turn on the landing. The game was as follows. One of the 4 stood on a step above the 3 others, sword in hand, and tried to prevent them from coming up while they deftly fenced against him. At first, D'Artagnan thought they were using blunt-tipped fencing foils, but then he saw some of them receive slight wounds. He realized that their swords were fully sharpened. At each wound, the fencers, as well as the onlookers, laughed wildly. The man in the upper step was holding off his opponents with amazing skill. A circle had formed around them. The rule was that each time a man was touched, he moved down one place on the waiting list for an interview with Monsieur de Treville, and the man who had touched him moved up one place. In 5 minutes, all 3 attackers had been touched, one on the wrist, one on the chin, and the other on the ear, by the defender above them, who remained unscathed and thus gained 3 places on the waiting list. Though he tried hard not to show it, D'Artagnan was astonished at this pastime. He came from a province where hotheads were common, but he had never seen swordplay on such trivial pretexts, and the blustering bravado of those 4 men went beyond anything he'd ever seen before, even in Gascony. He felt as if he had been transported into the land of giants where Gulliver was so frightened. And there was more to come. He still had to reach the landing and the anteroom. On the landing, there was no swordplay. Instead, men were telling stories about women, and in the anteroom, stories about the court. On the landing, D'Artagnan blushed. In the anteroom, he shuddered. His lively, roving imagination, which in Gascony had made him dangerous to young chambermaids and sometimes to their young mistresses, had never, even in his wildest moments, conjured up half those amorous wonders or a quarter of those gallant exploits spiced with the famous names and intimate details. After his sense of morality had been shocked on the landing, his respect for the cardinal was scandalized in the anteroom. To his amazement, he heard open criticism of the policy that made Europe tremble and of the cardinal's private life, which so many powerful noblemen had been punished for trying to delve into. This great man, revered by D'Artagnan's father, served as a laughingstock for Monsieur de Treville's Musketeers. They mocked his crooked legs and his stooped shoulders. Some of them sang satiric songs about Madame d'Agneau and his mistress, and Madame de Combalet, his niece, while others made plans against his pages and guards. To D'Artagnan, all this seemed monstrous and incredible. Now and then, however, when the king's name happened to be mentioned in the midst of the jeering at the cardinal, the mockers were silent for a moment, as if they had all been gagged. They cautiously looked in all directions and seemed afraid that their voices might have been heard through the wall of Monsieur de Treville's study. But soon an allusion brought the conversation back to his eminence. The jeering then resumed, and so did the outspoken comments on all his acts. D'Artagnan was terrified. These men are all going to be thrown into the Bastille and hanged, he thought, and the same thing will probably happen to me because listening to them makes me their accomplice. After always telling me how much I ought to respect the cardinal, what would my father think if he knew I was with these heathens? And so, as the reader will have guessed, without being told, D'Artagnan did not dare to take a part in the conversation. But he strained his eyes and ears to make sure he missed nothing, and despite his trust in his father's recommendations, his instincts and inclinations made him consider those men's outrageous behavior with more approval than blame. Since he was a stranger in the crowd of Monsieur de Treville's courtiers and had never been seen in the anteroom before, a servant came up to ask him what he wanted. D'Artagnan humbly gave his name, stressed the fact that he was from Gascony, like Monsieur de Treville, and asked the servant to request an audience for him with his master. The servant patronizingly promised to transmit his request in due time. Now that he recovered a little bit from his first surprise, D'Artagnan began examining the clothes and faces of the men around him. At the center of the most animated group was a tall musketeer with a haughty face, dressed in a strange way that attracted everyone's attention. He was not wearing his uniform coat, which was not absolutely obligatory in those days of less freedom and more independence, but a slightly worn and faded sky blue jerkin. Let's hold on a second while. And over this magnificent gold embroidered faded blue jerkin, and over this a magnificent gold embroidered shoulder belt, glittering like water in sunlight. A crimson felt cloak descended in graceful folds, revealing the luxurious shoulder belt from which it hung a gigantic rapier sword. This musketeer had come off guard duty. He complained of having caught cold and coughed ostentatiously from time to time. It was because of this cold, he said, that he was wearing his cloak. While he talked loudly, conceitedly twirling his mustache, everyone, including D'Artagnan, enthusiastically admired his embroidered shoulder belt. "It's foolish, I know," he said, "but it's the fashion now, and besides, I have to do something with my share of the money from my father's estate." "Come, come, Porthos," said one of his listeners, "don't try to make us believe that shoulder belt came from your father's generosity. It must have been given to you by that veiled lady I saw you with last Sunday near the Porte Saint-Honore." "No, on my honor, gentlemen, I bought it myself with my own money," replied the musketeer, who had been addressed as Porthos. "Yes," said another musketeer, "just as I bought this new purse with what my mistress put in my old one." "What I said is true," protested Porthos. "I paid 12 pistoles for this belt." Admiration increased, but doubt persisted. "Isn't that right, Aramis?" said Porthos, turning to another musketeer. This musketeer formed a sharp contrast with Porthos. He was only 22 or 23, with an innocent, almost prim face, dark, gentle eyes, pink cheeks as downy as a peach in autumn, and his thin mustache drew a perfectly straight line across his upper lip. So French. He seemed reluctant to lower his hands for fear the veins might swell, and he periodically pinched his earlobes to maintain their delicate rosy tint. He usually spoke little and slowly, bowed often, and laughed silently, showing his beautiful teeth, which gave evidence of the same meticulous care he devoted to the rest of his person. He nodded in reply to his friend's question. This seemed to clear away all doubts about the shoulder belt. Everyone continued to admire it, but no longer talked about it, and the conversation abruptly turned to another subject. "What do you think of the story of Chalais' equerry has told?" said one of the musketeers, addressing his question to everyone in general. "What has he been saying?" Porthos inquired condescendingly. "He says that in Brussels he found Rochefort, the cardinal's right-hand man, disguised as a Capuchin, and that with that disguise he was able to take in Monsieur de Liege like a fool he was. Yes, he is a real fool, said Porthos. But are you sure the story is true? I heard it from Aramis, said the Musketeer. You did? You know very well I did, Porthos, said Aramis. I told you the story myself only yesterday. It's not worth talking about. That's your opinion, retorted Porthos. Not worth talking about? You're quick to jump to a conclusion. The cardinal sets a spy on a gentleman and has his letters stolen by a traitor, a scoundrel, a bandit. Then, with the help of the spy and the letters, when he has Chalais beheaded on the stupid pretext that he wanted to kill the king and have the queen marry the king's brother? No one had the slightest inkling of all that. You told us about it yesterday to our great satisfaction, and now we're still astounded at the news you tell us it's not worth talking about? Very well, then, let's talk about it, since that's what you want, Aramis said patiently. If I were Chalais's equerry, I'd make Rochefort wish he'd never been born. And then the Red Duke would make you wish the same. The Red Duke, exclaimed Porthos, clapping his head. Bravo, bravo, Aramis. What a charming name for the cardinal. I'll make sure it becomes widely known. You can count on that. I've always said you were witty. It's a pity you couldn't follow your vocation, my friend. What a delightful priest you would have made. It's only a delay, replied Aramis. I'll be a priest someday. You know I'm still studying theology. He'll do as he says, Porthos assured the others. Sooner or later, he'll be a priest. Sooner, said Aramis. He's waiting for only one thing before he finally decides to put on the cassock he hangs behind his uniform, said one of the Musketeers. What is he waiting for? Asked another. He's waiting for the queen to give an heir to the French crown. Let's not joke about that, gentlemen. Hey, Mikey. Hey. Let's not joke about that, gentlemen, said Porthos. Thank God the queen is still young enough to do it. They say the Duke of Buckingham is in France now, Aramis said with a sly laugh that gave a scandalous meaning to this apparently simple remark. Aramis, my friend, you shouldn't have said that, Porthos reprimanded him. Your wit always makes you go too far. If Monsieur Treville had heard you, he'd have made you regret it. Are you lecturing me, Porthos? Aramis said heatedly, his eyes flashing. Be a musketeer or be a priest, but don't try to be both at the same time, replied Porthos. As Athos told you the other day, you want to be the best of both worlds, but let's not lose our tempers. That would be useless, and you know what I, and Athos have agreed on. You're a frequent visitor of Madame de Agnon's house, and you try to win her favors. You also visit Madame de Bois-Tracy, Madame de Chevaux's cousin, and you're said to stand very high in her good graces. No, don't admit your good fortune. No one's asking for your secret. We all know your discretion. But since you have that virtue, use it with regard to Her Majesty. Anyone can say whatever he likes about the king and the cardinal, but the queen is sacred. If you talk about her, only good things. Porthos, you're unbearably pompous. You know I hate being lectured except by Athos, and someone with a shoulder belt like yours is in no position to be sanctimonious. I'll be a priest if it suits me, but in the meantime I'm a musketeer. As a musketeer I say whatever I choose, and now I choose to say that I'm about to lose patience with you. Aramis, Porthos, gentlemen, cried the other musketeers. Monsieur Treville awaits Monsieur d'Artagnan, announced the servant, opening the door of the study. At these words, everyone fell silent. The door remained open. D'Artagnan walked across the anteroom into Monsieur de Treville's study, thankful at having escaped the end of that strange quarrel. Next up, Chapter 3.